The allegations by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh has gotten a lot of people talking about Anita Hill recently, and for those of you like me who were too young to remember what happened at the time, here's a quick refresher. So as Olivia Waxman of Time explains, on October 11th, 1991, when she testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee, Anita Hill became the face of what was arguably the biggest sexual harassment case ever seen in the United States up to that time. Hill, then a 35-year-old University of Oklahoma law professor and commercial law expert, told the committee that 43-year-old Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas had ambushed her with unsolicited dirty talk when they had worked together at the Department of Education and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the early 1980s. Hill said that because they worked together at the time, she feared that if she spoke up or resisted, she might lose her job. Hill also told the committee that Thomas had once told her that he knew that if she ever told anyone of his behavior, that it would ruin his career. It didn't, however. Thomas denied everything and at one point characterized the hearing as a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks, which he said played to the worst stereotypes we have about black men in this country. Describing the experience of having reporters comb through his private life as Kafkaesque, he implored the senators to vote one way or the other to end the hearing. When they did vote, the Senate confirmed Thomas 52-48 on October 15th. He now sits on the Supreme Court. Now, that's a broad overview of the situation, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper because if you thought that that situation was a debacle, well, the way that the Senate Judiciary Committee treated Anita Hill, that was a national embarrassment in and of itself, and Vice actually put together a really good compilation just demonstrating how awful she was treated, and it was honestly hard to watch. Now, here is a portion of that video.
Tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged.
You testified this morning that the most embarrassing question involved, this is not too bad, women's large breasts. That's a word we use all the time. You testified, you drew an inference that Judge Thomas might want you to look at pornographic films, but you told the FBI specifically that he never asked you to watch the films. Is that correct? The fact is, flatly, he never asked you to look at pornographic movies with him. You said you took it to mean Judge Thomas wanted to have sex with you, but in fact, he never did ask you to have sex, correct?
No, he did not ask me to have sex. He did continually pressure me to go out with him, continually, and he would not accept my explanation as one as being valid.
So that when you said you took it to mean we ought to have sex, that was an inference, a mere allegation.
Senator, I would suggest to you that for me, these are more than mere allegations.
How reliable is your testimony in October of 1991 on events that occurred 8-10 years ago? How sure can you expect this committee to be on the accuracy of your statements?
I guess one really does have to understand something about the nature of sexual harassment. It is very difficult for people to come forward with these things.
I've got to determine what your motivation might be. Are you a scorned woman? Do you have a militant attitude relative to the area of civil rights? Do you have a martyr complex? The issue of fantasy has arisen. Are you interested in writing a book?
It is appropriate to ask Professor Hill anything any member wishes to ask her to plumb the depths of her credibility.
You are not now drawing a conclusion that Judge Thomas sexually harassed you.
Yes, I am drawing that conclusion. That is
well, then I don't understand.
Pardon me?
Then I don't understand.
Do you have anything to gain by coming here? Has anybody promised you anything by coming forth with this story now?
All we've heard for 103 days is about a most remarkable man, and they scoured his every shred of life, and nobody but you has come forward. If what you say this man said to you occurred, why in God's name would you ever speak to a man like that the rest of your life?
That's a very good question. And I'm sure that I can't not answer that to your satisfaction. That is one of the things that I have tried to do today. I have suggested that I was afraid of retaliation. I was afraid of damage to my professional life. And I believe that you have to understand that this response, and that's one of the things that I have come to understand about harassment, that this response, this kind of response, is not atypical. And I can't explain. It takes an expert in psychology to explain how that can happen. But it can happen, because it happened to me.
Well, it just seems that so incredible to me. That is a most contradictory and puzzling thing for me.
Now, for me, that was just so difficult to watch, and I actually got kind of emotional the first time I saw that, because when you really look into Anita Hill's eyes, you can tell that she was in disbelief at the questions they were asking her, and you can kind of just see that human pain, and it was tough. The way that she was treated was completely unacceptable. But in addition to the way that the Senate Judiciary Committee embarrassed her, well, there was also a really vicious, perhaps one of the most vicious smear campaigns lobbed against her ever by the right wing, with one of them literally writing an entire book about her that was just nothing more than smear. And this individual who published this literally coined the phrase a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. And today we're seeing a lot of similarities between the Anita Hill and the Christine Blasey Ford situation, and individuals who are operatives for the Democratic Party are speaking up. And in fact, one Democratic Party operative named David Brock, I'm sure we're all familiar with him, who actually worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016, he actually contended that the way Christine Blasey Ford is being treated is worse than the way Republicans treated Anita Hill.
And, when this started, I thought, this is going to be the Anita Hill treatment all over again. This is shabbier treatment than Anita Hill, because this is just an outrage that there are no other accusers being presented, none of the corroborating witnesses. Mark Judge, as you said, and no FBI investigation still at this moment.
Now, what's really interesting about that clip, and I'm sure some of you already know this, is that as he talks about how awful Republicans treated Anita Hill, what David Brock doesn't tell you is that he was part of that process. That book that I showed you earlier, guess who wrote that book? That was David Brock. He's the individual that coined the term a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. So really, he has the nerve to talk about how Christine Blasey Ford is being treated when he absolutely dragged Anita Hill's name through the mud. But to be fair to them, he's since switched political teams and he's recanted a lot of the horrible things he said about Anita Hill, and he now acts as a smear merchant for the Democratic Party, and he usually targets progressives and tries to smear them instead. And you can see a lot of his work in action if you go back to the 2016 election, where he tried to imply that Bernie Sanders was sexist and possibly racist. Now, regardless if David Brock apologized and recanted the horrible things he said about Anita Hill, that will always be a stain on his legacy. However, David Brock isn't the only Democrat whose legacy was tarnished by the treatment of Anita Hill, because the Kavanaugh debacle has reminded folks just how terrible likely 2020 presidential candidate Joe Biden handled the situation in 1991 himself. And as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, he should have not only done more to rein in Republicans who were making a mockery of the process and treating Anita Hill terribly, but he shouldn't have done so much at the behest of Republicans under the guise of being bipartisan and being fair. But really the worst thing Biden did that has tarnished his legacy is he didn't let other witnesses come forward and give their testimony. So as HuffPost's Amanda Turkle explains, Biden's most divisive and perhaps most significant decision was not calling the other three women who could have strengthened Hill's allegations against Thomas to testify. While the women's interviews with committee staff were entered into the record, that did not have the same impact as public testimony. One of the women was Angela Wright, who worked with Thomas at the EEOC. She said Thomas asked her about the size of her breasts, pressured her to date him, commented on the physical appearance of women in the office, and showed up at her apartment one night without warning. Unlike Hill, however, Wright said she considered Thomas's behavior obnoxious but not sexual harassment. Wright had complained of Thomas's unwanted behavior toward Rose Jourdain, a colleague at the EEOC at the time. As Meyer and Abramson wrote in their account of the trial, Jourdain independently remembered the bra size incident and also recalled Wright telling her Thomas had talked about the sexiness of her legs. Sakari Hardnett was the third woman. She worked for Thomas at the EEOC after Hill left, but said Hill's account of his behavior rang true. So the question is, how can Biden, a Democrat, who chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, not allow these women to come forward and give their testimony? He bungled that situation. Had he acted in a more competent and responsible way, it might be the case that Clarence Thomas, a very conservative Supreme Court justice, wouldn't be on the Supreme Court right now. But Joe Biden, in part, got us Clarence Thomas. And his legacy is so problematic with regard to his handling of the Anita Hill case that the New York Times actually published an article by Alexander Burns and Jonathan Martin, who question whether or not he'll be able to even overcome this if he does, in fact, choose to run for president, seeing that the wound has been reopened for a lot of women who watched his behavior and were appalled by it. Now, the authors go on to argue, as he actively explores a 2020 presidential run, the 75-year-old former vice president is coming under increased scrutiny from his fellow Democrats because of his role in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings in 1991, as explosive debates over gender, sex, and Supreme Court overshadow the themes of economic fairness that Mr. Biden trumpeted across the Northeast in recent days. His name has been invoked frequently in recent days, mainly by Republicans, for leading the 1991 hearings with an all-male, all-white Judiciary Committee aggressively questioning Anita Hill about claims that Judge Thomas had sexually harassed her. The hearings have long been a source of discomfort with Mr. Biden among Democrats who remember the process. Publicly, Mr. Biden has expressed regret about the way the Hill hearings unfolded. Privately, he has also described it as unfair that Ms. Hill continues to hold him responsible for her rough treatment in the Senate. Advisors to Mr. Biden said there was no current plan for confronting his handling of the Thomas nomination more exhaustively, and Mr. Biden has not reached out to Ms. Hill during the Kavanaugh hearings. Yet, Mr. Biden's associates say he would not be deterred from seeking the White House by the thought of having his record picked over. And understand that this is so serious for Joe Biden that there are actually members of the Democratic Party establishment that are saying his success in the 2020 Democratic Party primary will hinge on how he handles this. Barbara Boxer, for example, is on the record saying he needs to address it and it could be a plus for him, but if he botches this response, it could hurt him. So this is very serious for Joe Biden, and he has a lot to explain. I mean, think of the nerve of this guy who thinks it's unfair that Anita Hill still holds him responsible. Well, look, I get it. Time has passed. It's been decades since then, but Clarence Thomas is still on the Supreme Court doing damage. In part because of you, Joe. Anita Hill, her name was dragged through the mud because you failed to do your job as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. You wanted to play patty cake with Republicans, and you refused to limit the parameters of the discussion. You basically said, or you literally said, not verbatim, but I'm paraphrasing, he said that they should be able to ask her anything in order to get to the bottom of it. I mean, you saw it in the clip that I played.
It is appropriate to ask Professor Hill anything any member wishes to ask her to plumb the depths of her credibility.
So his handling was absolutely atrocious, and he definitely needs to explain why he mishandled this situation so fundamentally. I mean, to say he bungled this would be an understatement. So there are other issues with Joe Biden. There's the crime bill and whatnot, his centrism and corporatism. But this truly is one of the biggest blemishes on his legacy. And if he doesn't apologize and vociferously speak out against his actions there, this will hurt him. And even though this is technically beneficial to progressives who want Bernie Sanders to be successful in 2020, I think more importantly, he needs to do the right thing morally, because this is what would help give individuals like Anita Hill closure. So this was really, just, again, seeing the way she was treated was heartbreaking. And I hope that she gets the closure that she's looking for, because she did not deserve to be treated like that. I believe her. And maybe it would have been the case that we could have defeated Clarence Thomas had Joe Biden allowed other witnesses who corroborated Anita Hill's testimony to come forward.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.